Okay, I can see participants joining. So in the interest of time, because it's only for an hour, I suggest we start. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone joining us. My name is Harjeet Singh, and I'm the founding director of Fatah Sampada Climate Foundation. And it's a privilege to welcome you to this very crucial discussion with an amazing panel who I will introduce as they speak. We gather here today at a very critical juncture. We all know that at COP28, world governments finally made a promise to transition away from fossil fuels in a just and equitable way, yet a promise without a plan, and more importantly, without the right kind of finance. So clearly, it remains an empty world. And a just transition requires trillions of dollars. It's absolutely clear if we really want this transition to be accessible, fair, and with full of grants-based finance. Instead, what we are seeing is how wealthy governments are pushing a private finance first model, a model that has clearly shown that it drives only debt, deepens inequality, and fails to deliver the speed and scale of the change that we so desperately need. So, this conversation today is much more urgent. Also, by seeing the disappointing outcomes of the recent Bonn climate talks and the Financing for Development conference that was concluded in Seville, Spain, where we could see that the world's wealthiest governments once again failed to unlock climate finance at scale and without committing the grants-based finance. So out of this frustration, of course, we are going to put forward a powerful and unified message, and it's very clear that we have to make rich countries and make polluters pay. And today we'll explore this growing movement and public-led solutions that offer a real path forward. And to set the stage and frame our conversation, it is my great honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Anne Gelema, who is the executive director of 350.org and has had many hats, leading various international institutions. And 350.org, as you know, is a global movement dedicated to building a fossil fuel free future and drive the just energy transition. And the floor is yours. And you're muted if you can unmute yourself.
That's not a very professional keynote speaker, is it? Thanks, Harjeet, and thank you everyone for being here for the launch of this very timely report. We do stand at a crossroads. Ahead of us are two paths, and the choice we make will define our future. One path leads to deeper climate chaos and deeper inequalities, entrenching the injustices and instabilities and conflict that already scar our world. The other leads toward a livable planet powered by a just and equitable energy transition. A just transition is not simply about swapping out fossil fuels for renewables. It does require a fundamental reordering of our world, a redistribution of power, of wealth, and of political priorities. And we cannot assume that that redistribution is going to move in the right direction, that the move to a green economy is going to be fair, inclusive, with people and communities at its core. We are going to need to push against the tide to achieve this. And for too long, we have been sold a dangerous fantasy. We've been told that the very system that profits from planetary destruction, the world of private finance, was going to magically lead us to a sustainable future. And we were told that the role of governments was to step back, to simply make the world safer for private profit. And today, and with this report, we are here to declare that this fantasy has actually turned into a nightmare. The private sector first approach has been tried, and it is a catastrophic failure. The evidence is quite overwhelming. We see the chasm between the funding that is needed and what is being delivered. We see profound geographical injustice, where clean energy investment flows to wealthy nations, while the global south, which bears the least responsibility for this crisis, is left further and further behind. We see a system that funds what is profitable and not what is just, nor even what is actually necessary for a livable planet. Shiny new technologies get attention, but the essential work of a just transition, like building accessible and clean public transport, ensuring universal energy access, and supporting workers and communities as they move away from fossil fuels, that work has been dangerously neglected. And the reason that it is dangerous, that neglect, is because it makes a transition politically extremely difficult and even impossible. The primary tool that has been offered to the Global South, so-called blended finance, has been exposed as a deception. As currently implemented, is not a bridge to trillions in investment. It is actually a debt trap that is pushing already debt-distressed nations deeper into a cycle of dependency. It is a tool that is delivering more loans, more conditions, and more neocolonial control, all under a green veneer. However, critique is not enough, and we are here to champion an alternative that is already showing us a better way forward. The historical record and the reality on the ground tell a consistent story that public finance is the engine of change. In fact, every major energy transformation in history has been led by strategic public action and investment. Private capital has not led, it has followed where the state has already paved the road, absorbed the risk, and set a clear direction. In fact, that is part of the reason that fossil fuel dominance is so hard to overcome. We all know about the trillions in public subsidies that prop up the fossil fuel industry and continue to artificially inflate its return on investment. However, it's not just about the subsidies, it's also because over the decades, governments have geared market design, regulatory frameworks, and infrastructure investments to support fossil fuels. By the very same token, this means that governments which are ready to lead can flip the switch. And already we see national development banks underwriting green innovations that also create jobs and improve lives. We see governments steering coal phase-outs, not by waiting for the market, but by creating enabling conditions for private and public sector activity to contribute to outcomes that are pro-poor, pro-women, and pro-planet. We see that for the most vulnerable nations on the front lines of this crisis, public finance isn't just helpful, it is in fact the only way forward. But that comes with a crucial warning. Public finance is a powerful tool, but it is not automatically just. A transition that is publicly funded, and unfortunately we also see some instances of that happening today, a transition that is publicly funding can still be used for political patronage rather than public benefit. It can still trample on the rights of Indigenous peoples, women, and local communities, and it can still replicate an extractive logic of the fossil fuel era. That transition, regardless of whether it's publicly financed or not, is not a just transition. It is simply green neocolonialism. And that brings me to our task. We have to fight not just for public money, but for public power, guided by accountability and justice. Our call to action must be clear and unwavering. First of all, we must abandon the failed private sector fantasy. It is time to demand that our governments lead again. And that means embracing a new toolkit, proactive, gender equitable, and inclusive green industrial policy, expanding public and community ownership of energy, strong accountability to citizens and civil society, and strong regulation to steer the market towards the public good. Second, we must demand climate justice in the form of real financial commitments. The Global North must pay its climate debt, and that means massive, predictable, grant-based public finance, not more loans. Finally, we must demand systemic change. Our fight is for immediate debt cancellation for the Global South and for a new, democratic, global financial architecture that serves people, not creditors. The challenge is immense, but we are armed with the truth, and we are building a movement powerful enough to turn that truth into reality. Let's go forward from here to demand a future built not on private fantasies, but on the public realities of justice, equity, and solidarity. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Anne, for that powerful and inspiring address. And thank you for framing the moral and political stakes of the challenge ahead and what's needed. And thank you for saying it's not just public finance, but also public and people's power. Right. Thank you very much again. Now we will turn to the hard evidence that Anne briefly alluded to and how that backs up this call for a new approach. So first we will hear from Claire O'Manick and Bronwyn Tucker of Oil Change International. Both are co-authors of this groundbreaking new report, Private Fantasies, Public Realities, which will provide a stark data-driven analysis of why the private-led model is failing. Claire and Bronwyn, over to you. Please share your key findings with us.
Thank you. Yes, thank you so much for having us here today. Just checking you can see our screen. All right.
Yeah, if you can put it to full screen. Right now it's also showing.
If you want, Claire, I can screen share so you can start on the presentation. Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks, Bronwyn. Yeah, so as mentioned, OCI has released a report that looks at both overall global flows for the just energy transition and blended finance as a key solution posed by international institutions, as well as the Global North, to fund the energy transition, particularly in the Global South. And so hopefully in a second, yes, here we are. Thank you, Bronwyn. Great, we can just go to the next slide. Here we can see the energy transition related investments over the past decade. And as we can see, 70% of the world is getting 15% of energy transition finance. And this has largely remained the same, with the majority of the finance and growth over the last decade happening in advanced economies in China. And so this really shows the issues with the current approach to financing the transition. Next slide. And so to highlight some of the key findings from our report, we built a project-level blended finance database for energy transition-related sectors. And so blended finance is the use of concessional finance, so public finance provided at below market rates, either maybe lower interest or longer term, or in like very, very few cases as grants, aimed at lowering overall project costs to boost profitability and attract private finance that otherwise would not be invested. And so we built out this database with the majority of the projects being for renewable energy electricity generation. And what we found is that the mobilization rates of private finance are much lower than what major models and policy pledges have assumed. So looking at the most recent data, we found that public finance invested in the energy transition did not leverage the sort of $4 to $7 in private finance that it claims it will for every one public concessional dollar, but it was only $1.12, and that this fell to less than 60 cents in low-income countries. Two other key things to take away is that overall, the overall amounts of finance are quite low. So it's not bringing in the sort of, as they say, like billions to trillions that they say it will unlock. And that it's also particularly low in low-income countries, where they also, the projects that we drew from are initiatives that are aimed at providing finance to these countries. And that despite the emphasis on attracting private finance, that these initiatives really are attracting more public finance. And so the private finance that's being mobilized is also quite a small share of the overall finance. So next slide. And so if we put that into context of what does this look like when we look at major models. So here we compared our finding of the crowd-in rates to what the IEA assumes in their net zero emissions finance model for how much finance is needed. And we found that it's creating a really big gap, $550 billion. And so this, of course, leads to major shortfalls in finance, which is, again, putting our ability to get to 1.5 degrees at risk. Next slide. And one more quick point before I hand it over to Bronwyn, and I won't go into too much detail, but as we can also see here, this is just looking at where finance is going for the energy transition. And we see that key subsectors that are really needed to ensure that this transition is just and that it happens at all are really, really underfunded. And these are also areas where we're seeing that blended finance isn't able to deliver. And where there has been strong investment, we also see that these are areas where governments have been really directly involved. And so now I will pass it over to you, Bronwyn.
Thanks, Claire. And okay, this diagram that I'll start with. Okay, great. Sorry, my internet has not been great today, unfortunately. I think Anne set up this kind of policy schematic perfectly. But I think basically, in terms of kind of putting blended finance really in context, the finance that Claire was talking about is really what we see rich countries kind of proposing as the alternative to holding up their responsibilities to cancel unfair debts and to pay their fair share of climate change, of climate finance. And so that's where kind of on the left, we can call that the private sector first or de-risking paradigm. And this really sets out a pretty narrow role for government of really just kind of there as the small assistant to the private sector to put relatively weak incentives to crowd in money. And what we're seeing is this really is not working. I think it's also a bit, it's definitely a double standard where then in the global north, in the areas, which are definitely not all of them, but in places like renewable energy or electric vehicles where we see more finance going forward, they in reality are actually really supported by some of the tools on the right-hand side or some of the ones on the bottom. So I would say on the bottom where we have a couple of tools where it really depends on their design. Subsidies is the most kind of well-known example of this, where you can design a subsidy to really give big handouts and just profits to the private sector in a pretty unfair way, but they can also be designed to support households or build out key sectors. And so what our argument really is that we're looking at a really small set of tools for the most part that are being offered to most of the world. And that's the kind of private sector first approach. And that we really need to take a much broader approach and remember that governments can do much more difficult and harder things. And Louise is going to cover some case studies after this showing many of the places where these approaches are already in use. And just quickly, I feel like other speakers are already kind of covering these, which is perfect. So I think what we find really the bottom line is that the private sector first approach that rich countries are really proposing for climate finance is not delivering. It can play a role if there's strong safeguards and some changes to design, but it on its own really cannot deliver what is needed. And that's where we need governments to take a much more active role. And because of our unfair financial architecture, that's where we need to see the climate finance and debt cancellation and fair finance rules come in. And lastly, just that there really is no shortage of public money for this to happen. And this is a graphic we had made last year for the climate finance goal fight, but it really still stands where there's, we see so much public money going to the sectors that are really harming people and driving the climate crisis. And that's where there's just absolutely no excuse for saying we can't find the money. And I'll pause there.
Thank you so much, Claire and Bronwyn, for that sobering analysis and critique. The numbers speak for themselves. And it's really important to know how that approach is not working. But also, as mentioned, we must talk about and champion what works. And for that, I'm delighted to introduce Louise Hutchkins, Director of Campaigns at Stamp Out Poverty. Louise will share the new report, Fast, Fair, Forever, which moves from critique to solution and highlighting real-world case studies where public finance is already delivering a better, fair, and just transition. And Louise, over to you.
Thank you so much, Harjeet. And I think we have a slide at the end of the pack if somebody could put that up. So yeah, really this report, Fast, Fair and Forever, How Public Finance Can Supercharge a Just Energy Transition. It's a political initiative as much as anything, this report. It's a response to this powerful narrative that we're hearing from the Global North governments over the past series of international meetings, certainly at the last COP, but also echoed in Seville and in Bonn, that we can't raise money in the Global North for international climate finance. Our coffers are bare. What can we do? We have to turn to the public sector. And as they're cutting the budgets, they're saying private financing will fill the funding gap. And the public sector is really only there to take on the risk while the private sector takes the profit. And as Anne said, this is not the only role that the state can play, and that public finance is not only helpful, but it's the only way forward if we're actually going to succeed in the rapid and scaled up transition in the energy system that we absolutely must see, not just for climate, but also for justice and access. And so this report is an initiative from across civil society. Stamp Out Poverty reached out to friends across the sector, and we're really pleased that Satat Sampada, Christian Aid, CAN International, PCAN and 350.org have been working with us on this report to really gather the evidence that we have about why public finance must lead, how to ensure the transition is just using public finance, and what countries are already doing in this space. And it's to galvanise our movement and climate negotiators around this alternative approach, which we think still can succeed. So I'd encourage you all to have a look at the report, but I'll just share with you the main outline. So first of all, on why public finance must lead, and we heard powerfully from Anne on this already. We know that we know that public finance must be the bedrock of the green revolution. It's not an optional extra, because unless it serves as the backbone, the transition won't happen, because it won't be fair. If it's not fair, people will resist it, because they absolutely rely on the jobs that they have at the moment. And we need to create a lifeline to an alternative energy system and economic system that takes people with us on that journey and supports them through that. Otherwise, they will resist and it just won't happen. And the only way to ensure that is to put public finance right at the heart of it, because as we've heard, we can't leave this to capital markets. Capital markets follow, they don't lead, and they certainly don't lead to the places where people need the energy. And we can see that already with the hundreds of millions of people who don't have access to secure clean energy. There's no reason to believe that the market would change direction and suddenly provide the people who need energy with the energy that can be provided. So what we wanted to do was really document why you need public investment for these strong market signals to shape the market and send large-scale investment in the right direction, but also invest directly in some of the enabling infrastructure and approaches that would be needed in order to get this right. So making sure that the money is scaled up and it's grant-based and it's public-based, so that it can go into all kinds of enabling sectors, including education and training, into the infrastructure that you need around this energy system, and into supporting people to transition from reliance on polluting industries and energy sectors to clean ones. So this is absolutely essential. And in terms of how to ensure the transition is just, we've got really amazing content in there about the role that public funding can play in social protection, on making sure that those jobs are decent jobs, that they're unionized and properly supported, and that we don't face a situation where people are just displaced from fossil fuel industries. So there's really useful content in there about how the public sector can be used as a proper engine behind justice. And we've seen where it's gone wrong in experiences. We've all heard experiences from India where there are large solar parks that have displaced marginalized communities, and unfortunate, although at scale, transition to solar in Pakistan, where there are a number of downsides that communities are really facing, the difficulties and outcomes of not having a strong public sector led role in that. And so then the other area of this report is really about the proof, about where public sector is taking a lead and public investment is taking a lead. This isn't theoretical, this is happening. There is a huge amount to learn from where this is already happening at scale and in some really interesting ways. So the report looks at examples from Brazil to India to China to Chile, looking at how green finance has been the cornerstone of underwriting really large-scale renewable projects, national solar missions, scaling up massively the production of renewable energy and phasing out coal in a way that supports people through that process. So I'd very much encourage you to look at this as it's a very short, succinct report, and hopefully will be very useful in galvanizing our movement behind the agenda that we really need to see.
Thank you so much, Louise. I didn't see the slide, so I have this pamphlet with me so I can share that and recognizing all the partners who have been engaged, and particularly Pacific Islands CAN, that has played a very important role in co-authoring the report. And thank you, Louise, for particularly highlighting the role of public-led future and saying it's not a theory. There are so many examples and how it is being built and unpacking the elements and covering the aspects and underlining justice in just transition and even indicating some of the dangers that exist. So thank you so much, Louise, for that. Now we need to move forward in terms of evidence on, after talking about the evidence of what's failing and what is required, we also need to talk about some of the policy conversations that have just concluded in the last few weeks and how they are going to affect the reality that we see, and whether they are on track to ensure whether money is available for the just transition. So to provide that very crucial context, we have two expert speakers. First, I would like to invite Mariana Pauli, who is the Global Advocacy Lead at KristianAid, and then Bronwyn Tucker, who you heard, who's co-author of the new OCI report, but also Global Finance, Public Finance co-manager at Oil Change International. So we'll start with Mariana. Mariana, over to you. Share what happened at the 4th International Conference on Financing for Development, F54, where some of us were there in that scorching heat of 48, 49 degrees Celsius, which we all felt. So over to you, Mariana.
Great. Thank you so much, Harjeet, and hello, everyone. Yeah, and in fact, I would like to share a few reflections in the context of the politics of not just the Financing for Development Conference, but also Bonn. And especially because what those two key processes have in common is they did not deliver. They became much less ambitious than they should be. And to some extent, the general perception is that maybe those multilateral processes on climate and development are just not delivering, but in fact they have one key reason behind. They're not being ambitious enough because of the developed countries refusing to fulfill their commitments, to repay their climate debt, to implement common but different responsibilities, their fair share of finance. So, it's instead, we see the opposite, what was mentioned here. You see them cutting the aid budgets, the far-right governments coming into place and increasing military spending, etc. So I think this is one of the first commonalities between the two. And behind that, we know that it's the provision of the grants-based climate finance at scale and the development finance is a matter of political will. We often see throughout, and I think the strong presence of the private sector, private finance approaches in Seville, but also in Bonn, comes with that argument that the public money is limited. We see, for example, in the NATO conference, that commitment of countries to increase their military spending to 5% by 2035. Today, for example, just have an idea, there is already a expenditure of 33% of GNI on climate versus 264, which means military risk is just growing. So it is a matter of political will. So in both processes, there is a very perverse shift of narrative here, because it is developing countries who will be blamed for the years to come for not generating the enabling environments, the possibilities for private finance to come and for private sector to come and deliver, when we know that it won't work because it's based on profits, not the needs of communities. So instead of that responsibility, so this is, I think, that the biggest commonality and risk that we see between these two process. So the developed countries managed to get away with their responsibility, or trying to get away with that responsibility, when we know the private finance won't solve the crisis. Now, the next slide, please. So yeah, I guess some of the main challenges that we have is that both the climate finance within the UN climate talks, as well as the role of the finance for development, are based on the fact that more money is flowing out from the global south to the global north than vice versa. It's about 2 trillion per year. And we know that exactly the current global financial architecture is not adequate to address the multiple crises. So the financing for development process is the right place, is a fundamental area where actually the global south can reverse this trend. It's really about where there is an equal voice and participation, and therefore decisions taken there can favor those who are most marginalized in communities from the global south. But yet again, in the whole FFD process that has been negotiated throughout the year, we saw the UK, the EU, the US blocking and diluting the final outcome, which means maintaining the status quo, because those institutions, they control economic decision making. For example, it was staggering to see the figure that about 40% of the participants in Seville, or 6,000 delegates, were from the private sector. Maybe half of the side events were actually addressing private finance in one way or the other. Even the Brazilian presidency of COP30 was in Seville, taking conversations forward on the roadmap from Baku to Belém, which is looking how to the 1.3 investment goal will be delivered, where most of the conversation was focused exclusively on how can we leverage, how can we de-risk, how can we create those enabling environments for climate, when, for all the reasons what we've heard here been discussing, those discussions are not working because they're putting the profits before needs. So I think what the main challenge that we have ahead is really what my favorite scholar, I love Daniela Gabor, who says, we are experiencing really the Wall Street climate consensus. In FFD3, the big mantra then was about how the billions to trillions would deliver for development, how private sector would come in to in the forward, when even by the bankers, the World Bank chief has admitted this year, it did not deliver, right? So I think the whole narrative has to be deconstructed, and we have really a big job to do ahead of us in global processes, but also the regional and national level, to deconstruct a bit those myths. Our current financial architecture, it continues to be unfit for purpose. Of course, FFD has given us a few avenues to continue the conversation forward. which I'll mention in the next slide. Yeah, which is we didn't get in out of the financing for development for the UN debt workout mechanism, which was one of the main outcomes that the Global South and civil society have been campaigning for. But we had already some stage to continue the conversation in an intergovernmental process to address gaps of international debt architecture, making recommendations, which is the Article 50. I think it's also exciting to see the initiating of a debtors country group. And I think from what I understood, from what Zambia and Spain were saying, that we might hear more about those already around UNGA and maybe around the G20 on that. There is also, I think, if we compare with FFD3 in Addis in 2016, the big issue then was the establishment of a UN tax convention or UN tax body, and that did not happen then. However, that provided the political environment to continue that advocacy, and years later, the African Group of Negotiators managed to get that resolution that UNGA approved, that it started what's now being negotiated as the UN Tax Convention, and FFD has a continued commitment to engage on this, despite the refusal of UK, France, and a few others on that. So I think there is a lot more that can be done in terms of advocacy to get to a UN debt convention to address the debt crisis. And thirdly, democratizing economic decision-making remains key in this agenda. There is a continued commitment on this, could have been a lot stronger, yes, but I think this is an agenda we have to push through the reforms of the shareholdings of the bank, the 17th IMF quota reform, etc. And the last one is on the SDRs, the Special Drawing Rights Playbook, which can be a key tool to help developing countries to deal with that. So there are other venues to follow. FFD has been an important moment to galvanize collaboration between the Global South, climate justice and economic justice groups working together to address those issues. And that's where COP30 and with the outcomes of Bonn, which Bruno will share with us in a minute, will be really important to keep connecting the dots. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Marietta.
Yeah, go ahead, Bronwyn, please.
Thanks, and yeah, I'll be quick here. On Bonn, I think the definitely the brightest light, and very, very much thanks to civil society and deep coalition work. There was a draft text for the Just Transition Work Program that's quite strong, and that's been forwarded to COP30. And so now our job is to defend that. And this is very much setting out a holistic just transition mechanism. And so thinking across sectors, not just to energy, and also definitely looking at finance for just transition, but also dealing with trade and coordination across sectors and pieces like this. And so I think that's definitely the best kind of good news out of Bonn. I think overall, we definitely, I think it's no surprise that, we're facing strong headwinds in multilateralism, but we did see the kind of a braver and louder joint push across Global South blocks to bring back the fight from COP29 of really the Global North just neglecting their climate finance. And so this fight to get that obligation more strongly on the main agenda did not have like a linear win. Like ultimately it's not there, but it will definitely have the impact of kind of pushing climate finance more into more strongly into the spotlight in the places where there are already hooks. And so that is definitely a good thing, but it does bring some challenges. And that's where I think the metaphor that's been haunting me from our colleague Rebecca at CAN is that we need to make sure that we're not kind of pigeons going after breadcrumbs. And so, there's lots of hooks looking ahead to COP30. I think we need to be clear that Brazil, as the host, is, I think, more excited about what they perceive as easier wins than finance, and also just that we don't have, that it's a long-term project to build the political power. So I think preventing backsliding is really, really key. And then also making sure we kind of group on strategy and aren't kind of split across too many items. But I think there's, yeah, definitely good momentum and possibilities there. And yeah, I think overall, I do think just really highlighting that while we are seeing, you know, aid cuts and increases in military spending, I think it's very much a moment of just that the center is not holding. And so in Seville and in Bonn, we saw a much louder voice, not just from civil society, but also, for example, the official expert group of Financing for Development, really punching holes in this narrative that private finance can do it and that the Global North, you know, can get off the hook for their responsibilities. And so I think our job going forward is definitely continuing to break that narrative and showing especially public in action and the positive side of what is already happening, because there are really great case studies and examples to build on. There's exciting moments ahead for the UN Tax Convention, which was a really big win to push tax rules into a more democratic space that's not just fully controlled by the US and the rest of the Global North. And similarly, our debt justice colleagues who were really focusing on a debt convention in Seville have already earmarked the UN General Assembly in September as the next key moment for this, and they're absolutely not giving up. And then lastly, I think just obviously these are political fights, and so I think that's you know, taking advantage of the small opportunities we have right now, particularly maybe with the US as a kind of common enemy to a lot of countries. And where I am in Canada, I definitely see there's more opportunity, I think, for Canada to kind of concede on some of these issues. And yeah, and then of course that political power starts at the grassroots. And I think building an internationalist climate movement, especially in Global North countries, to do what is needed is really important. And looking ahead, there's the September 2025 Global Days of Action, and we can share the link with info for that, because that's definitely one key step coming ahead.
Oh, thank you so much, Mariana and Bronwyn. Extremely rich, and thank you for further presenting this analysis, how this really connects with what is needed and what's really happening, and also talking about some steps forward. And thank you to all other speakers for weaving together such a clear and compelling narrative, the evidence of failure, the blueprint for success, and also the reality of the political blockages we face. And of course, money is available, but it's going to the wrong direction. We now have some time to take questions from our audience. I can see 2 questions now. Okay. And yeah, please keep posting your questions, although we have less time, but we would love to respond to your questions either now or later. I would like to invite all our panelists to turn their cameras on if possible. And yeah, and also be ready for a comment that I'll come to you later on. But we'll start with Mariana. There's an anonymous question for you, Mariana. Could you please elaborate on your point about financial flows moving from the global south to the global north than the other way around? I would appreciate a bit more detail, as that wasn't clear to me. Mariana, you need to clarify that.
Sure. The main issue is that the fiscal space in the global south is really squeezed, and that's essentially because of the debt crisis and the tax crisis they're going forth. At the moment, we have about 3.3 billion people living in countries that are spending more money on servicing their debts instead of spending this on this revenue in schools or hospitals, for example. So debt servicing is a really big part of this flows. And the second one is tax evasion, tax avoidance, illicit financial flows, which are also a big responsible for that. And third is really about how actually, when you look at all those private sector investments, what are the companies, how they're resourcing, etc. It's all about more profits, and even the role of private finance and include that, commercial loans, which are still like good business for the global south, count for that. So it is a international financial system that is dominated by the global north, where the taxation and the debt essentially means that these flows are happening this way. So we need this international financial architecture transformation, not only reform, a transformation to shift those flows and address that.
Thank you so much, Mariana, for clarifying that. There's another question from Leo Roberts. His comment is, this is wonderful. Thank you so much, all. I wonder if any of the speakers could give their thoughts on how we go about communicating these very rational, logical asks to global north governments in such a way that they are not dismissed or ideological rhetoric. To my mind, there is a disconnect or blind spot within these governments whereby they don't seem to recognize that the failure to take a new approach to international climate and energy transition finance would mean missing the mitigation targets they prioritize. Absolutely. And I always talk about the enlightened self-interest, which rich countries are not really recognizing. Anyone who would like to respond to that question? How to communicate it to the global north? Who would like to come in?
Can we get, because I haven't spoken yet, so
Please
Louise
go ahead.
should go. No, let Louise answer and then
Louise.
I'll come in.
Okay.
I'll be very brief. I was just going to say that a big part of the answer is answering the question, why isn't there any money? Why are the global north governments saying they don't have any money to pay for this? And it's two things, isn't it? It's been a massive transfer of wealth from ordinary people to the super rich over the last 10 years or so, on a scale never seen in human history. And a huge amount of money going to the fossil fuel companies. So the fossil fuel companies have made $2.8 billion in profit every single day for the last 50 years. There is a lot of money out there. So part of the way we respond is we build a movement that points the attention on those responsible and forces our governments to hold them to account. And we do that through sharing ideas, by raising these in mass movements, by getting on those demonstrations on the 20th of September and placing the accountability back where it needs to be. So I think it's about building power amongst ourselves and pointing responsibility back where it needs to be. I think that is a huge part of the answer. I'll pass over to, and I'm saying that also, I'm the convener of the Make Polluters Pay coalition internationally. So I would say that, but I think it's an immensely important part of the political response we have to this, because around the world, we're seeing far right parties saying, let's not do climate change anymore. Let's not send any money to the global south because we can't afford it. Well, we can afford it, and we need to hold those responsible to account.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Louise. Tasneem, please come in.
Yeah, I'm just going to be slightly contrary on this one.
That's exactly, we have brought you here. Please go ahead.
No, there's absolutely nothing that we can do and say that's supposedly rational that's going to change the minds of northern governments. Let's be clear about it. Report after report after report. Who we need to be convincing are the people in the global north, and help them with that information to build their power and then take on their governments. We've been in the boardrooms of governments in the global north. Last year, when we took up the campaign, 5 trillion, the global north owes the global south the climate debt, there were activists who were nervous about going with a very rational number to go and ask their governments, please, to support that. When activists are nervous to go to their governments to tell them that they owe the global south money, and that's the amount based on studies, then we have a problem. So honestly, we are always going to be accused of coming up with ideological rhetoric, etc., even though right now you have an amazing OCI report, even though we have this amazing report on Fast, Fair, Forever. We must empower our people. People need to use their power to shift things. the governments, yeah, I'm sorry, really, and here the challenge is for global North activists to, start pushing their governments much more strongly. They're not going to be convinced by so-called rational arguments, and I will talk a little bit about the politics when we close. I'm really sorry, that's quite dismal, I know. It's not good news, but listen, if we're not clear about this now, at this point in time, we're living through this chaos, then we're going to start, we're going to develop strategies that might not achieve what we need to. And for me, I think all of the speakers spoke about people's power. That's what we need.
Thank you, Tasneem. And in fact, you've partly responded to a question that came from Kathy, which is about how. So Kathy is saying, building political will is key to climate and debt solutions. Fossil fuel companies, Putin and Trump-aligned forces are flooding the zone with disinformation. She's asking about, do you have tips, strategies, or upcoming convergences that can help counter this misinformation and build momentum for real solutions? So anybody who would like to weigh in further, building on what Tasneem said and everybody said about people power, or any other thing that you would like to add to respond to the question. Any of the panelists, please jump in.
Just very briefly, it's very important for the climate movement to work together with the economic justice movement to fight for this UN debt convention moving forward. I think the FFD momentum was just the start, was not the end of this process, and there's a key opportunity to link up both agendas on what's happening in the climate space and the debt space. So I think we have a lot of work to do in the global North, in our advocacy, in our campaigning, in connecting the dots between these two agendas throughout the political moments. And I think it's for the long, so it might be a long road ahead, but we have to work together on it.
Thank you so much, Mariana. We are nearing the end of our time, and if any other speaker would like to give a short comment, 30 seconds, 1 minute before I hand over to Tasneem. I don't see
Well, I
anybody.
just guess to echo the sense of urgency. We've done the long game. We don't have time for the long game anymore. We have to get out there and organize. So we have some of the really strong arguments from these reports, from all of our movement. We've got a really big opportunity on the September the 20th. It's global mobilization on climate. And this is the moment for everyone to get out there and build this power, not just amongst the climate movement and the debt justice movement and the tax justice movement. We need to be reaching out to ordinary people who are feeling the squeeze at the end of the month and make our solutions around climate and justice, their solutions to their everyday lives, and make those connections, because that's how we build power, and that's how we get bigger, and that's how we overturn the tables that are set against us. This is a dynamic moment. Let's not lose it. Let's go for the big gold and reach really high.
Thank you, Louis. That was very helpful. I saw Bronwyn, you would like to come in briefly. Go ahead.
No, it's all good. I'm gonna type in the chat box so we can hear from Tasneem.
Okay. Any word on mobilization? I know 350 has been at the helm of it, and not to put you on spot, but if you'd like to come in.
No, thank you. Yeah, no, 350 has been working closely with CAN International on there's a whole week of action around a just transition. And the highlight of that week will be global mobilization on September 2021, as Louise has said. And I think, as everyone has emphasized, it is really important, especially now, especially with some of the governments that we have in power around the world today, not least the Trump administration, to show everyone that we are here, we are powerful, we are not going away, we are going to keep pressing our demands. And the way that the mobilization is being planned is to also join forces with the groups that are campaigning for economic justice, for debt justice, for democracy, political and civic space, so that we all can bring one common agenda in front of politicians and governments and corporations. So the more we can get behind that, the more power we build, not just for COP, but also for making our demands more powerful to national governments as well. It's a really key
Super.
moment.
Thank you
Thanks.
so much, Anne. And yeah, it's all about building power and our alternate path, global and our reality. And no better to give our concluding remarks and a call to action. Tasneem, over to you. Tasneem Essop, as you know, is the Executive Director of the CAN International. Tasneem, over to you. The floor is yours to close our session.
Thank you very much, Harjeet, and greetings to everybody. So yeah, I think, the speakers have spoken about the context in which we're living. We're obviously living through the most challenging, in fact, most horrific times since I'm sure many of us can remember. And of course, there have been horrific times in our history. So clearly, during times like this, we're going to have to depend on our own power. Well, not ours on this call alone, but certainly of the masses of people who have fought before and have won in the cases in our history where we've needed to change systems quite dramatically. And this is a point at which we're talking about public and private finance, we're talking about the financial system. We need to, of course, contextualize all of this fight that we are dealing with now within the wider systems change fight, the overall fight, and where we are on the arc of our history. In fact, are we at the point where the neoliberal system that has been largely responsible for the kind of private sector-led approaches, the kind of market-based approaches, deregulation, etc., whether we are seeing the end of that system or not? Well, of course, we can't think it's going to die a natural death. We have to contribute towards the end of that system through our fights. Now, for the past few years, in fact, we have been trying in the climate movement, at least, to build a cross-movement mobilizations. Harjeet, you would know the first time we tested this kind of approach was through the Loss and Damage Fund, where we made that the big fight. We built coalitions around it, not just from the climate movement. We fought that fight and we won it. We took another fight. We fought on the phase out of fossil fuels. We took that up to the Dubai COP. And okay, it's not a great victory, but it's still a precedent decision where governments agree to transition away from fossil fuels. So there are examples, I'm saying this especially for those who are asking questions in the chat, where if we use our collective power, when we use our collective power, we can have some victories. So imagine if we built this power from the ground up, not just in the climate movement, across movements on multiple issues, whether it's the issues of, justice. In fact, fighting for justice across the board is a good unifier, I would argue. So certainly building that kind of momentum behind mobilization. And this year we continue the same, the kind of global days of action, global week of action like we did last year, pulling people together with a focus on just transition and, of course, phase out of fossil fuels and finance. So the week will culminate in a big, massive showing on the 19th, 20th, and 21st, which pulls together all these issues of finance, the energy transition, the broader just transition. So we need to continue mobilizing. But I want to, and I know that we're running out of time, sorry, Harjeet. I want to also contextualize the fights that we're having as peoples in the world and the politics that's happening at the moment. All of the kind of global North resistance and the fact that they continue resisting the need to fulfill their obligations in terms of law, international law. In this instance, the Paris Agreement and the Convention. It shouldn't come as a surprise to us. in a time when impunity has become the order of the day, in a time when multilateralism is being dismantled as we speak, in a time when international law is being trampled on, we shouldn't be surprised when the very players who have impunity, who use wars and military might to settle their challenges or the difficult ones in the world, we shouldn't be surprised. And so what we are witnessing at the same time then, and I'm hoping you would have followed the BRICS meeting, the BRICS outcome. They've produced a framework declaration on climate finance as the BRICS nations. So the point about multilateralism and defending multilateralism is going to be a global South fight. It really is going to be a global South fight. And the issue of multipolarity and the strength of multipolarity is something that we're going to witness emerging, and we're seeing that happen. I mean, Trump's whole trade fights, his unilateral actions, his conduct in terms of disrupting economies worldwide is going to result in, and has resulted in, global South countries asserting their power. And if you read that declaration from the BRICS nations, they're literally saying they're ready. They're ready to take on the climate finance, to also contribute to financing the transition, etc. However, they assert very strongly that that doesn't mean the global North mustn't fulfill their obligations in terms of the Paris Agreement. And again, they reaffirm their support and commitment to the convention and the Paris Agreement. So what we are facing, besides the fact that we need to assert our own power, build our power and use our power, on nations from the global South that's digging their heels in. Let's not be surprised. That's why Article 9.1 came onto the agenda in Bonn. That's why you will find them trying to come back and claw back, getting the global North to fulfill their obligations. This is a massive political fight. It's not a technical fight. We need to recognize that the fight for finance system change, the fight for public finance as the center of that finance system change, the fact that we must change the institutions because they're outdated and still controlled by rich nations, all of these fights are part of the wider fight at this point in our history for change. And we have a huge responsibility as peoples in this world to make sure that that change, that arc is going to lean towards justice and not take us in any other path, down any other path that we've, of course, experienced too many horrors of that kind of, when the mighty use their power and destroy the world and its peoples. We have a responsibility to address it. I'm really sorry, I'm tired.
No.
I just got off a long flight.
No problem at
But
all.
I'm really feeling that, in the end, we're going to have to depend on ourselves, people. Yeah. In the end, we're going to have to depend on ourselves. So let's build power. Let's show our power. Let's use our power, and let's win some victories at COP30. We can, actually. I mean, it's minor compared to the big victories, but every little bit helps. We have to celebrate our successes, and we can win the Just Transition Work Program in COP30 at the end of the year. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tasneem, for those powerful words and a call to action. And thank you again to all our speakers and to everyone who joined today. Let's take this energy and turn it into action and build people's power. Thank you. And with those words, the webinar is now included. And we will stay connected, and we'll send you all the presentations to all the registered participants. Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Thank you.